This is Grandmaster Daniel Naroditsky. We are watching Magnus Carlsen taking on Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, the Frenchman with three names, in their match at the 2023 Champions Chess Tour Finals. And Magnus Carlsen starting the game with a ready opening. One knight f3. Magnus, of course, can play everything equally well. And on the second move, he plays kind of a reverse Benoni with c4. And Maxime trying to decide which direction he's going to take this game. And the principled move is d4. That leads to a reverse Benoni setup, but Maxime, he plays a Queen's Gambit declined. e6 is on the board. Now, Maxime is typically a Grunfeld player, so maybe Magnus is trying to take his opponent out of his comfort zone. g3, Magnus fianchettoing his bishop, playing this like in English. Maxime continues to develop his kingside, bishop e7. Now, d4 would transpose into a Catalan, but it seems to me that Magnus is trying to keep the spirit of the position alive. The move b3 here is more typical for English players. So b3 is possible. d4 leads to a mainline Catalan. Magnus taking his time, making this important opening decision. And let's see what Carlsen decides. He continues to ponder his move, and there it is. And indeed, he has played the move b3, preparing to fianchetto his second bishop. Double fianchetto setups are always so interesting, but they can be very risky because white concedes a pretty large share of the center. The principled response for black is now to push that d-pawn up to d4 and then to secure it with the c-pawn. d4 followed by c5, and that is exactly what Maxime does. He is one of the most principled players out there. Magnus Carlsen, will he fianchetto the bishop? No, he will immediately contest black's center with e3. Now Maxime, he is unlikely to capture on e3. He will want to maintain his control over the center. Instead, he plays the move knight to c6. Magnus Carlsen seems to be caught a little bit by surprise. The more standard reaction would have been to start with c5 and then to follow up with knight c6. And Carlsen trades on d4. A lot of tension in the center. Fianchettoing the second bishop. Magnus Carlsen attacking the knight on d4. And if Maxime will not maintain his stranglehold on the d4 square, then the entire concept with knight c6 will turn out to be very dubious. That bishop on c8 is also blocked in by the pawn on e6. So Maxime's queenside is under some fire, and he's trying his best. And let's see what Magnus decides. Now, he can take twice on d4. Black's queen will ultimately land on d4, and the queen is a very vulnerable piece. So Magnus deciding, does he want to take on d4? No. He leaves the knight exactly where it is, and instead, he completes his development. This is a very typical Magnus move. He tosses the ball back into black's court, and the knight from c3 can also potentially jump to a4, hitting the bishop on c5 and introducing an element of discord into black's position. Now, Maxime, he can develop his light-squared bishop to d7, but that looks like a very awkward move indeed. The knight from f3, it can also jump into e5, opening up the diagonal for the g2 bishop. Rook to e8 is Maxime's choice. Magnus Carlsen uncomfortable with the kind of position that he has reached. My inclination would be to play knight to e5 here, because that would make it very difficult for black to open up the diagonal for the bishop. And Magnus, he follows the commentator's advice. A big mistake. Knight e5 is on the board. And that knight on e5, it's a pretty loose cannon. It's not protected by anything, but white can bring the rook down to e1. And that might be necessary. Maxime brings his bishop back to d6. That's a one-move threat. Obviously, Magnus is not going to move the knight away from e5. That would defeat the entire purpose of what he is trying to do. Rook e1 looks like a very natural move. f4 instead. Magnus choosing a more aggressive option, protecting the knight with a pawn. And in the event of a trade on e5, the pawn would replace the knight. It would still make it impossible for black to develop his bishop, and the f-file would open up. The f7 pawn would be incredibly vulnerable. That seems to be out of the question. Has Maxime Vachier-Lagrave misplayed this position as he tries to establish the knight on d4? The bishop goes back to c5, and obviously a big threat of a discovered check against the white king. Magnus very likely will move his king over to h1. He can also consider attacking that bishop with knight to a4, but these types of adventurous moves, not really Magnus's style in a rapid game. King h1 seems very safe. He plays it. And Maxime, he's been kind of moving back and forth. He still hasn't solved the problem of his queenside. And now the knight on e5 is firmly entrenched. It's protected beautifully by the pawn on f4. Magnus's king is completely safe. And a little hesitation there from the Frenchman. He was about to play queen d6. He didn't like something about that move. Maybe it was that knight a4 move that I had talked about earlier, hitting the bishop on c5. Maxime has only 2 feasible queen moves. He can play queen e7, he can play queen d6. Neither of those moves seems particularly attractive. He does decide on queen e7, so changes his mind about his move. Remember that unless a piece has been released, you do not have to move the piece to that square. You have to move that piece because it's touch move, but you can move it to a different square. Now, knight a4 looks really juicy here, but Magnus plays on the other side of the board, g4, and down goes white's pawn. Magnus says, I'm castled to the king side. I don't care. The king on h1 is completely safe. It's protected by the bishop on g2 and the pawn on h2. And the f and g pawns, they are tasked with shattering black's own king side. That pawn is going to move into g5, and it's going to open up the e4 square for white's knight. That will be a catastrophe for black's bishop on c5. Black's position is on the verge of crumbling. Maxime, he prepares for the apocalypse with a move rook to d8, adding another defender to the d4 knight, but down goes Magnus's pawn. Up to g5 it goes, forcing the knight back to d7, and now the e4 square has been carved out for white's knight. Knight to e4 is going to attack the bishop on c5. It's going to open up the diagonal for white's dark-scored bishop, and this game might end in checkmate on the king side. The queen from d1 is begging. It's begging to be placed on h5, where it will participate in the attack. Magnus Carlsen centralizes his other knight. Knight e4 is on the board, and Maxime Vachier-Lagrav's central campaign has resulted in complete and abject failure. He still has not developed his queen side. He's playing this entire game without the use of his bishop, without the use of his rook on a8, and Magnus Carlsen's pieces, his bishops in particular, are operating in a beautiful symphony of strength. Knight to f8. MVL says, I'm not going down without a fight. The knight drops back for defensive purposes. It can probably be rerouted up to g6. Maxime would do very, very well to get rid of, at the very least, one of Magnus Carlsen's knights, which are currently terrorizing black on both sides of the board. And some important decisions here for Magnus Carlsen. He could take the bishop on c5 and grab the bishop pair and cash in his chips, but he says, no, I am going for more than that. The queen joins the attack. Queen to h5 is on the board. Now the direct threat is knight takes c5 and queen takes f7 check. Black's queen is going to be overloaded. Maxime might have to play knight g6. That was his idea with knight f8, and he plays it. The knight on g6, a very good defender. And Magnus, you can just sense he's looking for the kill shot. He's looking for the killer blow. He can still take the bishop on c5, but the knight from e5 can also retreat down to g4. And what a move by Magnus, threatening knight f6 check. That knight is going to sacrifice itself on f6, and black's king is going to be massacred by the combined forces of white's queen and white's other knight. Knight f6 check is a devastating threat. The bishop on b2 will also join in the attack. Maxime is busted here. He has no moves. He tries to whip up some counterplay desperately with bishop to a3, and he might eliminate white's bishop, but I think white's knights and white's queen are more than capable of carrying the load, and Magnus still looking for that kill shot. Is it time for knight g or knight e to f6 check? That seems to work very nicely. Knight f6 check. If black takes the knight, then white can take back on f6. Maybe Maxime wants to sacrifice the queen on f6 for 3 pieces. That might be what Magnus is contemplating. Move 19. Magnus already on the cusp of checkmate, and there it is. Knight f6 check. The knight is sacrificed, and Magnus recaptures with the pawn. That is the subtlety. He takes with the pawn in order to attack black's queen, and most importantly, to vacate the g5 square for his other knight. What a genius concept by Magnus Carlsen, who resists the tempting move and instead plays the killer move. And now knight g5 looks like the killer move. That is going to be checkmate, ladies and gentlemen. Black can defend the h7 pawn with knight to f8, but then f7 will fall with mate. White can also deliver Lolly's mate with queen h6. There it is, knight g5 on the board. Maxime, he runs with the king, but there is no chance. It's Usain Bolt racing against a 90-year-old. Rook to d7. Everything is collapsing. Magnus picks up the knight on d4. The rook cannot capture back, and Maxime throws in the towel. What a clinical miniature by Magnus Carlsen. An incredibly high-quality game as he destroys Maxime Vachier-Lagrave in their match game at the 2023 CCT Finals. All smiles at the end of the game. And I hope this game put a smile on your face. Thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you in a subsequent video.